Enjoy a seat at the table and good company, where great conversations and meaningful discussions happen.
Welcome to And Good Company. I'm Sarah Fiedelholtz. We all know a great dinner party isn't really about the food. It's about the people seated around the table engaging in lively discussions. And Good Company gives you a seat at the table to enjoy smart and interesting conversations as they happen. I am pleased to again be in the company of Dr. Jeffery Webb, a professor of history at Huntington University. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So unlike a lot of the conversations here, I don't necessarily know or have a context for which I want to talk about. But truth be told, this is in context with my own personal interest with this idea of happiness and the pursuit of happiness and how it has sort of how it drives and creates lots of good and bad things in our society. And I really wanted to have you as a history professor because I really want to understand what was Thomas Jefferson thinking when he included the phrase as one of the inalienable rights, pursuit of happiness, in the writing of the Declaration of Independence. So first, let's just start with what was the purpose of the Declaration of Independence? Why was it written? Let's just give us that background.
Yeah. So it's a very interesting document because the colonists had been sending petitions to Parliament to have these laws overturned that they disagreed with, and these were kind of greeted with indifference, and the colonists grew more and more frustrated. And so it's sort of the final statement of the colonists that we've tried petitions, we've tried remonstrances, they called them at the time. We tried these appeals, to reverse colonial policy that had, in their sense of things, damaged them economically and also kind of violated their sense of rights. So the Declaration of Independence is a declaration that there will be no more declarations, no more remonstrances, no more petitions. The colonists are declaring themselves to be a separate country, no longer under the authority of the King of, the King of England. And if you look at it, the document's really written to what Jefferson referred to as a candid world, right? So it's really written not for the King of England anymore or for Parliament. It's written for educated people around the world who are interested in this conflict between the empire and its colonies. It's written for posterity. I mean, he's clearly writing this as a bequest, to future Americans who will kind of read it and try to understand what happened between, the colonists and their king.
I also think that he was in some ways also writing it for the colonists themselves and for the people who were going to be building this country. So one of the first things...
Can I just real quickly, that's an excellent point. Because there was a division of opinion in the colonists about whether independence was the right idea. You had people that were a little bit more inclined to support the king, feel like, well, couldn't we do more to patch things up? There were these kind of olive branch petitions and these kind of attempts to restore harmony. And I don't think that there was a consensus in the summer of 1776 that independence was the right approach to this conflict. And so this is an attempt to persuade people who are still fence-sitting, who are still kind of trying to decide how to think about
because he really was trying, he had to get people to understand that they were going to overthrow a government. And really, it wasn't just for their freedom, but he had to make it irresistible so that people would want to do it. And because also, I think what's interesting is you explained in most colonial charters at that time, they did have life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, which were the basics of what was defined as a free man, right? And then Thomas Jefferson takes the life, liberty as the inalienable rights and pursuit of property and changes it to pursuit of happiness. And obviously, what we're going to get into is how this meaning of this phrase, the intent of it, and how it's evolved. And clearly, it has evolved. So what I want to take a pause for a second and ask you more of a philosophical question, because I think this parlays into both understanding the Declaration of Independence as it does the Constitution. Do you believe that they are living documents that need to be read and interpreted based on today's morals and values, or do you believe that they should be literally interpreted within the context of what was said and meant at the time they were written and then applied to today? And I think that the reason I'm asking this is because I do think that's important as we're going to talk about this evolution of what was the intent and what is meant by pursuit of happiness.
Can I say that we can do both?
Yeah.
You know, I feel like there's an argument to be made that we should understand these documents in their context and what these people might have meant by this turn of a phrase, or as you suggested, this shift from the life, liberty, and property on the one hand to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Maybe there's a peculiar sort of impulse that sort of surfaces within this context that makes Jefferson express himself that way. But then we can also consider this, as the Founding Fathers did, a source of inspiration for change in the future. Like they didn't think of themselves as, what would you say, kind of stuck in the past or beholden to some tradition. They really thought of themselves as free to, you know, question the existing status quo, the arrangements that were sort of thought to be sacrosanct, right? And they came up with the U.S. Constitution, and when it was argued in the Federalist essays during the ratification process, Madison, Hamilton, and Jay are making the case that people are free to change their systems of government. They're free to cut ties with the past and with tradition and make arrangements that work for them in their present, and that present constantly unfolds, right? So you have this idea, I guess, of a living constitution, that we should be thinking about how this applies to us and not just what it might have meant to people living in 1776 in the case of the Declaration, or 1787 in the case of the U.S. Constitution.
So that would be along the lines of the governed thinking about the type of government and creating that government that they want based on the time in which they live, right? Would that be more, I mean, that kind of idea?
Yeah, again, I think I'm agreeing with your second point about the possibility of seeing these documents kind of shift in their meaning somewhat as society changes, as society develops, as our political situation evolves, because it does, you know, and the kind of country that we have, say, in the mid-20th century is a different country than the Founding Fathers experienced when they, you know, designed the Constitution and lived out the first Federalist administration.
So talk about the idea that you explained that the phrase pursuit of happiness is what you would describe as elastic. So let's start there. So let's start about the phrase itself. What does that mean?
The pursuit of happiness has, you know, roots in English political writing in the 18th century, and even going back to the late 17th century with John Locke. His two treatises on government were read by all the Founding Fathers, as well as another book that he wrote called An Essay Concerning Human Understanding.
And he was, would you say he was like a philosopher, or? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. John Locke was a political philosopher, but also he was interested in, I'm going to give you this fancy word, but he was interested in what's called epistemology, which is essentially the study of knowledge, how we know things, how we come to kind of perceive the world around us and then make sense of that world. He wrote a lot about that kind of stuff, and he, in an essay concerning human understanding, he has a long passage where he uses this phrase, pursuits of happiness, or pursuit of happiness. And the influence of that sort of idea, I think, carries through into the 18th century when you have like these very, very literate, politically active colonists like Benjamin Franklin, John Adams. They will have read these texts from the late 17th century. John Locke's two treatises on government, for example, offer a kind of big think understanding of how we got governments in the first place, what purpose they should serve. He ends up landing on this idea that the purpose of government is not to, glorify God or sort of carry out God's will on earth, like maybe an earlier period we might have thought, or to sort of coerce people into compliance, which, we think of the kind of government's job is to kind of keep the peace. Locke really reformulates this and says the purpose of government is to preserve and protect the natural rights of the people. And in the two treatises, he says, and among these are life, liberty, and property. And he has these long passages where he kind of explains that. Well, Jefferson sort of takes these ideas from Locke, the idea of natural rights to life, liberty, and property, and that's what government's supposed to do, is protect those rights for us. And we can change our governments if they don't, right? And then he pulls this concept of pursuit of happiness from this other Locke text, an essay concerning human understanding, and you get this kind of hybrid, this kind of blend. And I think for Jefferson, the phrase pursuit of happiness probably worked better for him than property in that particular moment, right?
Right. Well, and then also you talk about that he wasn't the first to use the phrase, that there was Samuel Johnson, who was one of the greatest literary figures of the 18th century, and he actually was commissioned in 1946 to write the dictionary. So he talked about this idea of the pursuit of happiness. So how did Johnson define it?
So he's using it in a tract called The False Alarm, which all the Founding Fathers would have read. It's about the John Wilkes case in England. There's this radical reformer that wanted to reform the Parliament so it was more representative. He wanted every Englishman to have a vote, for example, which wasn't the case in the 18th century. He wanted constituencies, like legislative districts, where people who live in that district go and represent. It wasn't the case, right? The way that Parliament was chosen was pretty customary. It was haphazard. A lot of it were appointments from the king and the king's ministers. So John Wilkes gets censored by Parliament, and so Samuel Johnson actually writes in defense of Parliament, like this guy needs to be, kept away from the House of Commons. And in his usage in in this tract I was kind of mentioning, he is essentially, I don't say preaching, but he's kind of talking to Englishmen who are starting to make these demands that Parliament be reformed, that it become more responsive, that it become more democratic. And he's saying the pursuit of happiness entails individuals kind of accepting responsibility for their action, right? That the happy state is one in which individuals will, recognize that they may have license to do this, they may have freedom to do this, but it would be imprudent for them to kind of take that action because it might have these blowback effects or these costs inherent, right? So he's talking about people developing a kind of self-limiting, internalized condition of self-restraint that would enable them to live in peace and comity in a kind of political community, right?
And he talks about the idea that you shouldn't blame the government for your circumstances, right?
That's right. People are going into Parliament a little bit like today, right? And they're saying like, I'm miserable because the government's doing this, and this, and he's trying to communicate to them that, look, you have control over the way you feel about these things,
right?
And you need to kind of have this, this kind of set of brakes on your own attitudes and your own sort of opinions, so that you kind of can live in a way that would be a kind of responsible way to live, for lack of a better word.
And talk about that, how that the pursuit of happiness within the definition of the civil wisdom, which was talk about that from Johnson.
So there's a very long tradition in political writing in the ancient world, going back to the Romans and all the way through the Middle Ages, this idea of kind of civitas, the idea of kind of living in community, and what are some of the core attributes of the person who's living well within the context of again a political community. So civic wisdom to Johnson would be, again, this understanding that there's a greater good, and we have to sort of consider that in all of our actions, right? And we just can't sort of act on impulse. You know, we can't act on what we think is in our own self-interest. There has to be this, you know, kind of sense of shared responsibility for the health of the community.
Right. So Johnson sort of to me was like also saying that, you know, you have to look and accept the political status quo in a sense, where Locke to me was saying that people could band together and form governments and change things. I mean, in a sense, right?
Yeah.
So we got Johnson, which gave one understanding and perspective for that Jefferson read, and then let's go in a little bit more to Locke, because I think that Locke really had more influence in understanding, again, what we were trying to do here is what was Thomas Jefferson thinking? So talk about how Locke really believed that the pursuit of happiness was the foundation of liberty, but not in the sense of freedom. Talk about that.
Yeah, it will sound like there's some resonances between the way Locke used the phrase pursuit of happiness and the way Samuel Johnson will use it 3 or 4 generations later. But for Locke, it is, it sort of shows up in a passage in an essay concerning human understanding, this phrase, pursuit of happiness. And he is essentially saying in this passage that many things that we do in our life, again, he's not talking about politics in this text, he's talking about human understanding and, you know, what it means to live well, you know, and so he's recommending in this passage that the pursuit of happiness take into account our long-term well-being. So we're often confronted with choices in which we can, you know, get some kind of like instant gratification or some kind of instant short-term benefit. And what Locke was saying is oftentimes we have to choose against that in order to have a truly happy life, in order to have a life that's fulfilled. Because, like, you know, I might be a person who really enjoys alcohol, but if I really drink a lot of that in a short time, I'll become an alcoholic, and then I won't have this opportunity for long-term well-being, right? So Locke was sort of advocating happiness as a pursuit, right? A kind of like life project in which you constantly kind of think about your choices and always choose the thing that's going to be in your interest in the long run.
And not only in your interest, but in the greater good as well.
Well, and this is what's interesting about Jefferson and applying it to this, the American crisis and the idea of independence is taking this idea which Locke is sort of individuating, or individualizing, I should say. And with Jefferson, he's really talking about like the whole political community.
Right. And the whole, and
we have individual rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, but there's a register of meaning. This is why I think it's kind of elastic, in which he's really talking about the common good in the Samuel Johnson sense. You know, like we need to think about what's beneficial for England and not just for your own individual. You know?
Although I thought that now Locke wrote what he was he the 17th century?
He wrote in the 1680s,
so
right after what's called the Glorious Revolution in England. This is a very important event where Parliament, well, most Englishmen didn't want the successor to the king to become the king because he was Catholic. This is context of like Protestant Catholic divisions. So they essentially forced the king to abdicate, and they brought in William and Mary to be the sovereigns of England. They were Protestant and Dutch, you know, and they had some connection to the royal family. So Locke writes in the wake of that, it's like we forced the king to leave. Was that the right thing to do? Could we justify that on philosophical grounds? And so you get the 2 treatises on government as an attempt to kind of explain how it is that you can go back to a state of nature and reform the social contract, right? And then on the basis of that, end up with something that looks like a kind of a workable government that everybody can agree to, right?
But the reason also I was asking was because, so he wrote in the 16th century, but he wrote about something that to me was like, this is so applicable today, which is the difference between imaginary happiness and true happiness. So can you explain what these are and what they mean in terms of this pursuit?
Yeah, well, this is, again, maybe tracking back a little bit in our discussion. I think this is Locke, right? I think he's equating imaginary happiness with that flash in the pan, short-term buzz,
immediate gratification.
I'm going to push this button right now and get my Amazon package in the morning, because I have to have it right now.
Right.
I can't wait 6 days, And again, you can kind of extrapolate that to a lot of the decisions that we make, which are, frankly, in that instant gratification, with that instant gratification mindset.
And immediate, and for ourselves.
Yeah, and Locke would say that's illusionary, right? That's you're sort of imagining that you're happy because you're getting this sugar buzz, from all the, the little things you're getting in your life right now. But he says it's the true happiness has an arc, right? It develops over the course of one's lifetime, and it reaches the state of maturity, right, where you kind of start to see, oh, I am a responsible person living in a community with other people that have a claim on my, my time and my resources. I have to care for my, my family, my church. These are sort of things that one realizes with a little bit more perspective, and I think that's what he's getting at. Is true happiness is over on top of that arc somewhere, and you have to sort of like set aside what you think will make you happy in the short term, this imaginary happiness.
Right. I mean, I think also that he was sort of saying that you have to have self-restraint and financial prudence, and you sometimes have to suspend the satisfaction of your desires for yourself for this greater good, which I think is really important because especially how we define happiness today, but this idea of imaginary happiness versus true happiness absolutely is one of the fundamental issues that I believe when we look at happiness today. So understanding that, now
what do you take those to be? Like, so if you're applying that to your own situation in the present, I want to make a distinction between my true happiness and imaginary happiness. Like, what does that look like when you're...
Well, to me, personally, or in terms of...
what could it look like to a
Well, I think that
person?
what I think it looks like is the idea of imaginary happiness is a lot of that, I will be happy when I get that job, I get that new house, I lose 10 pounds. And it's also very much about myself. It's very focused on me, where true happiness to me is when you really are doing things and achieving things that have benefit for you, but also benefit for the others. And that really, I think also what they've come out of in terms of the hit of research, and especially with positive psychology, is this idea that actually people find more contentment and are happier when they actually are doing things for other people. And when you are doing things that are for the long term, that the payoff that we all think we get in the short term really isn't, because what people thought when they lose those 10 pounds or get that promotion or get divorced, really, if they do experience any form of happiness, it's very short term. So I think what I really find is so interesting is that someone who wrote in the 16th century, I mean, really understood this driving motivation. And I think then partly what Jefferson was thinking, and I don't know if he was really this, sort of smart in a sense. I mean, he was very smart, but really intentional of understanding this universal dilemma and desire in us, to then be able to take that and all that it means and put it in the Declaration of Independence.
Well, it speaks more to a human yearning, that's timeless. Property is great too. We have a right to property. We need property to get to this place of self-sufficiency, right? But swapping out these words enables him to reach for this somewhat more poetic expression of, like a deep human yearning that all of us have to...
I sort of felt like...
to live a fulfilled life.
Right. I sort of felt that it was his way. That's why I said when I say he was sort of talking to the colonists, I sort of felt it was like his way of inspiring us, the colonists, to do the hard work that it's going to take to create this country, because at the end, we're all going to be better for it. But there was also other reasons why he did not include pursuit of property. So can you talk about that, especially within what property meant at the time?
Yeah, so Jefferson's kind of famous for this kind of vision that a republic, when we're kind of creating a republic here in the 1770s, 1780s, and republic, in order to be successful, had to be based on widespread land ownership. You needed to have a citizenry, right, that could maintain the republic in good health, in which each person, possessed sufficient resources to support themselves. Like they weren't living in a state of dependence on like a landowner, or an employer.
Or the government.
Yeah, or the government, exactly. And so these are very old ideas. These go back to ancient Rome, right? This idea of a republic will function in a healthy way if individuals, possess enough resources to be able to sustain their own lives, right? Without
self-reliance.
Yeah. In the 17th and 18th century, this is going back a couple generations prior to Jefferson, it was common for people, and I see this in like some essays that I've read from like newspapers in the 1730s, and so, but they would use the word competence. Like at one point you strive for wealth and achieve some degree of economic self-sufficiency, and they called that a competence. Everybody needed to get one of those. But beyond that, then you're courting greed, you're courting avarice, you're courting acquisitiveness, and those are values that, certainly the Puritans in New England, rejected. Like that was selfish, that was self-interested. The community is the important thing. The city on a hill, we're going to build this commonwealth, we're going to perfect religion. That's what matters, not your own. Not your own economic well-being. So Jefferson's picking up a lot of these ideas from his culture, this idea of competence, economic self-sufficiency, and this is necessary for a healthy republic to thrive. But it's sort of complicated in the Declaration of Independence, where he's issuing these paeans to, natural rights to life, liberty, right? And if he says property, then suddenly he has to think of slaves, because this is a slave economy. Both the North and the South have slaves, and the Northern economy is tied into the slave economy in the South, especially after the Industrial Revolution, where the cotton comes from the South and then it's fabricated.
Because at the time, slaves were considered property.
Yes, right. So he has this contradiction at hand, right? So you have a natural right to liberty, but there are human beings that are owned as property, right, that are not experiencing liberty by any stretch of the imagination. So saying property and liberty at the same time would put that formulation into a state of tension that I think Jefferson gets to avoid by slipping pursuit of happiness.
Right, and also don't you think that by saying pursuit of property, that sort of implies partly...
Or kind of a natural right to property.
Or was partly what we were getting away from, like having to, people who were sort of, to the landowner, enslaved to the landowners, or the fact that we were trying to get away from a government that controlled the property and taxation. And
they thought they were slaves to the British Empire.
Right, so he had to, so he, but he also, one of the things that I think was that he was looking at was this idea of civic duty. Like it was that your happiness came from pursuing your civic duty, acting justly, and living in a state of moderation. So he was really, it was more of our natural right to have this state of security, right? So, and to talk about that in terms of his thinking of of pursuit of happiness, because it really wasn't about this euphoric state or that the individual everything should be great for me, but not for the person next door.
Happiness for me, but not for thee.
Right.
Well, that's a really good question. I feel like there's some context here that would help.
Okay.
And this is why maybe Jefferson is appealing to this Samuel Johnson sense of pursuit of happiness, of kind of checking your own agenda at the door and thinking about what's good for, in Samuel Johnson's case, all of England, in Jefferson's case, this new little project we're starting, right, this republic. It is the case that the American Revolution was very disorderly. I think this is lost on most Americans. They think of the Revolution as this, this project by these like bewigged and begowned men with tight, hose and the leather coats and the buckles and shiny buckles. That actually is a terrible misrepresentation of what happened. I mean, it is the mob. I mean, it's the Boston Tea Party. It's the burning of the Gaspé, where these people literally burned a patrol boat from the British Empire that was looking for smugglers to the waterline, right? They're harassing colonial officials. There's something, this is a little bit off color, there's something called Hillsborough treats, right? They would take the contents of a privy and they would smear it on the outside of a merchant who was cooperating with the British, right, and not following the non-importation movement or the boycotts. So when you take that into account, and there's actually some organized rebellions, the Paxton Boys, the regulators in North Carolina, and these organized rebellions against the local elite were of concern to all these founding fathers.
Right, because that was the colonials themselves responding that they were against what the colonial colonies were doing, right, in that sense. So it was really almost like worrying, not only were we having this foreign battle, but literally now we were going to have a domestic battle.
There's going to be these sort of lower sorts, they called them, who are going to challenge the elite control of these different colonies, which are now going to become states, right? And so what Jefferson is saying as a member of the elite is pursuit of happiness is a natural right, but it involves moderation. It involves learning to sort of live within the parameters of, again, colonial society, which is again sort of becoming this new republic. And there's this kind of concern, I suppose, on the part of John Adams and Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson that this disorderly impulse that's coming from the lower sorts, right, would make it impossible for them to actually have a republic that functions, right? Because these people have to learn, this is Jefferson's message, how to defer to their social betters, right? They can't constantly organize these rebellions and march on the Capitol.
Right.
This is what they were doing with the Paxton Boys. They were trying to march on Philadelphia.
Right, and so they were also responding to those kind of actions. But I'm curious to step back a second. I wasn't sure that, I don't know if Jefferson or the Founding Fathers' original intent was really to say, we don't want to be part of the British Empire, but more so saying, and there was a phrase that you used, and I was trying to remember what it was, when they sort of left you alone because they let you sort of govern the colony sort of govern itself. It starts with an S.
Yeah, the concept is salutary neglect. It's the view that the British Empire, which wanted to do empire on the cheap, they didn't want to have a big footprint like New Spain, with expensive armies and bureaucrats that they have to pay. So they started these corporations like the Virginia Company or the Massachusetts Bay Company, and private investors would fund all this settlement, building houses, et cetera, so on. So for a very long period, England just enjoyed the trade that came from colonies without having to put any kind of skin in the game. They didn't have a big footprint there, just a handful of imperial officials. And so they're doing this empire on the cheap. And so during that period, what happens is the Jeffersons, the John Adamses, we can go back in the colonial period if you want, but these men sort of become the leaders of their colonies, and they're able to make, decisions, I wouldn't say independent of the crown, but they're not necessarily in full communication. They'll send laws over to England. England will review them. Most of them are going to get, rubber stamped. They'll make a point out of saying you can't have that law, because that violates our prerogatives in England. So for several generations, these colonial leaders, and I'm talking about the strata that includes the framers, the signers of the Declaration, enjoy this privileged position of leading their colonies, of getting the deference from those arrayed below them, the working class, if you want to call it that, ordinary farmers, while then again being situated betwixt that group and the...
Right. Yeah. But do you think that if the British Empire in some ways didn't get greedy, which was taxation, and wanted all these additional taxes and wanted to pull more money even, out of it, if they would have let sort of the colony, you know, and the country, sort of what they do in some ways with, like they do today, like with Australia or Canada, where they really are independent countries, yet they do have a relationship.
Sing God Save the Queen.
Right. And so, you know, the idea of, unlike other, like France and, you know, Spain, where they really colonized, I mean, they wanted them under their control. Do you think that maybe we would all possibly still be under the British Empire if they, you know?
It's hard to say. We would call that sort of a counterfactual. It's like, you know, could it have happened otherwise? I suppose, you know.
But the reason I was asking is because I just don't necessarily think that originally the forefathers, and I'm talking John Adams, Washington, and Thomas Jefferson, really initially were sort of pushing back to really separate themselves. They really wanted that sort of them to ignore them again.
It's a long time coming.
Right.
You can kind of date this pretty closely to about 1775. You know, like they're still. I thought they were still trying to work it out. Still happy to work it out up until Lexington.
And so that's why I felt like that's really important, because here you are, all of a sudden, this sort of wasn't your game plan, and you have to pivot, and now you've got to write something.
Make a country.
Right, and sort of say why. And so that was, you know, and so I just wondered, you know, if you think about that, it can also think about, it gives some of the context of maybe the word choices and how Jefferson was thinking when he was creating this stuff, because it's sort of like we got to do this now, you know, type of thing.
Well, and it's, I'm glad you made that point. Like their first attempt to actually create a country wasn't really good.
Right.
I mean, now you can say, to their credit, they recognized that, and then, you know, they were adaptive. They, you know, were able to shift and pivot and create the U.S. Constitution.
Right.
But like, they're kind of feeling their way through this, you know, in many ways in 1775 and 1776.
And then you also had, the interesting thing also was at that time, we had a dramatic shift in American society as well. While they're sort of now realizing they got to draft this thing, because you said we have the spread of commerce away from the coast to the interior. We had what you call the market revolution. We have the acquisition of Western land, right? The expansion, the growth of the population. And then also the idea of immigrants started to come. And they weren't coming like those on the Mayflower who came to start the country.
City on a hill.
Right. They came because they wanted to get away from crushing poverty and economic subserviency and lack of religious freedom. So we also had then these immigrants who came to, and what they saw that the United States would give them was very different than what the colonials. So
that's an excellent point. I think there's this sort of sense in which maybe the civic wisdom and the republic and what it needs, you know, from its citizens, that stuff's not necessarily on their radar screen. It's important to Jefferson and John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, right, that this message get communicated to, again, I keep calling the lower sorts, this is the word they use back then, or a non-elite person. But that message isn't necessarily communicated to this whole new throng of people that come into the United States, for whom pretty much pursuit of happiness meant, I want to get to a place where I'm not starving, or I'm not like under the control of the set of landlords, you know, so.
However, I think that with the immigrants, and I think the reason I bring this up is shaping this idea of pursuit of happiness was because those immigrants, when they came here and what they wanted and what the colonists expected these immigrants to do was economic self-sufficiency. So the idea again of that we all have to not be reliant on the government or, you know, others, we have to be, and that was very important because everybody has to do their share and everybody has to find a way to make a living. I mean, you know.
And there's plenty of opportunities. People can come into the interior, there's land available. It's,
but I think that also, I think you have to take that into account, because when you think how that relates to the pursuit of happiness, it was this idea of economic self-sufficiency, that you have to pursue something that will lend to you being economic self-sufficient, which then creates the overall, you know, satiated state of happiness for everybody. So, I mean, I think, so now when you look at all of this, and then there's another whole issue that we also have to look at that became also at this time with the more people, going away from the coast and wealth moving, this was when America started with the idea of acquiring things. I mean, it starts with owning property and having those economic freedom to get things, right? So now we've got that having good things becomes also a passion of the American people, right? So, and then that's where the idea of American materialism comes from, right? And that was really sort of undermined and stressed by Ben Franklin, right? With his idea of affluence, reputation, and at that time they said felicity. So talk about that, because what I'm trying to show is there was so much that Thomas Jefferson had to be keeping in his head and thinking all at the same time while he was going to write this document. And so that's what I'm trying to show, that there's so much, that went into it. And then, sort of, was he really, it's sort of like I always joke when you analyze, like a story or something that a literary figure wrote, and you sort of say, well, he used this, is that really what he was thinking? Was that the author's intent? And you're sort of sometimes like, well, did he really think about it, or did he just write it? But I think what I'm trying to say is, okay, these are all the things that were happening, and then we can evaluate if Thomas Jefferson was really thinking these things. So talk about the whole idea of materialism and this idea of, personal success and reputation that Ben Franklin, and we've talked about Ben Franklin before, but talk about that in relation to this idea of pursuit of happiness.
So again, I would say Benjamin Franklin shared some of these values with John Adams and Thomas Jefferson about civic wisdom, about about differentiating between like true happiness and imaginary happiness. And it's like we want this kind of long-term, delayed gratification kind of culture, and Franklin was very much like that in his autobiography, because he hangs out with these guys in London when he's apprenticing, and they're getting bombed, they're having a good time, and he's like at home saving his money, and he has this kind of idea that if I make wise choices as a 19, 20, 21-year-old, they'll sort of pay off later. When you pass over the 1800s and into like the 19th century, we're talking about the immigrants and this kind of idea of materialism. I guess what I want to say is I think these meanings that Franklin personally had and Jefferson personally had associated with pursuit of happiness, right, which had to do with your own individual happiness, but again, also within the context of a political community that has demands on your time, right? Don't rise up in rebellion like the regulators or the Paxton boys. You got to pitch in.
Don't be irresponsible with.
But these immigrants don't have that experience. For them, it's just economic survival, and so I feel like the nuance of the pursuit of happiness is left behind in the colonial period and the revolutionary period to a certain extent. And we mentioned Benjamin Franklin. One of the most popular books in the 1820s and 30s and 40s is Benjamin Franklin's Autobiography.
Right.
So this is not Benjamin Franklin himself, it's the way people interpret Benjamin Franklin that becomes important. And what they're seeing is this guy made a boatload of money, became really famous. He had a incredible reputation. How did he do it? That's the American dream. I mean, this is the formula that people will want to follow.
Right. Riches, fame, and happiness was the pinnacle of human fulfillment. And that's also the idea of where the Horatio Alger stories of attaining this, but that also was demonstrated through material prosperity.
Yeah.
Okay.
It gets expressed that way, like happiness is to achieve kind of economic well-being.
It's like what Thorstein Velpen said about conspicuous consumption and how at the time, if they didn't have things, they'd use their children to demonstrate where they go to college or to use them. So, but at the same time, so you've got the popularity of Ben Franklin and this, really life achievement, and he, and this Horatio Alger and the state of your own success and fulfillment. But at the same time, we also have this struggle with man's search for meaning, and now we've got Henry David Thoreau and Emerson sort of, wait a second, your contentment and life fulfillment is not targeted to things or personal achievement. It's now sort of more creativity and expression and, you know, other non-economic preoccupations. So now you've got also this debate between Franklin's materialism and Emerson, who says we should walk, you know, in our inner path and strike out on our own to follow our instincts. And so now we've got, and not to conform, right?
I don't think this is a fair fight, though. I mean, I feel like the energy in American culture in the 19th century is really sort of coming from this search for, you know, affluence, the search for, you know, economic prosperity.
Right.
And then you have these little voices crying in the wilderness over here. They're saying,
no,
we really need
right.
we really need to kind of think about our materialistic, you know, values. And so those voices are important to recognize because they're coming alongside this.
But I also think it's important to recognize those voices because it's a lot of how the sort of zeitgeist of today
it seems to anticipate,
talks
you know,
about
where we're going to go.
How we think people should, you know, find your own path, you know, pursue your passion. If you love what you do, you won't work a day in your life. I mean, so, but let's back up. So we had all these things going on and we have all these influences. So in your mind, if you had to say succinctly as possible, what was Thomas Jefferson thinking when he wrote as these inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? What do you believe, as a historian and a professor, his intent of the phrase pursuit of happiness meant at that time and what he needed it to serve in this document?
Well, it's a political document, right? So I think he's got the idea that the polity, right, the institutions of government that we create have to be directed toward the pursuit of happiness for each individual. Now, these individuals, I'm not going to be short, sorry. These individuals have to also think about their responsibilities to the, you know, the political community, and they have to make wise choices. They have to think in terms of true happiness and not imaginary happiness. That's what Jefferson intended. But he was thinking about the future, right? And I think he was trying to create sort of a pole star, you know, out there that the people who become like our presidents and our senators and our Supreme Court justices, they can sort of think about what their jobs are in these, you know, political institutions, and that is to sort of like set our course as a nation, set our policy toward the individual pursuit of happiness for each person.
And do you think that's also partly why we have such expectations of our presidents and politicians, that they're going to put aside their own selfish pursuits or their own personal gain for serving the greater good, you know, which obviously becomes an issue. Yeah. So, but okay, so now we understand how we got to Thomas Jefferson writing this phrase. So how did we go from what he really thought it would mean to how we interpret it today?
I think that has to do with, you know, some developments that happened in the 20th century in American culture. This has to do with, you know, the emphasis on, you know, your own individual, as you mentioned a little bit ago, your own individual happiness, whatever that means for you. You know, if we're going to set aside economic issues and the idea of self-sufficiency. That's kind of a 19th century preoccupation. Now it's like success as you defined it. So there are these self-help books that come out in the 1930s and 40s, like Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. One of my favorites, Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich. And there's a surprising amount of what we would now recognize in hindsight as pop psychology in there,
right.
Like how to think positively and how to train your mind sort of to, you know, get to a place where, you know, anxiety and fear and all that stuff sort of like, you know, in the rear view mirror, and you're just living your best self. You know,
right.
you're being your best self. You're living your best life.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of traction to that idea. You know, it gets picked up by prosperity gospel preachers like Joel Osteen and things like that. So it feels very modern to us. Like, you know, being happy is something that happens inside my own head, and it's the result of pursuing, you know, my dreams or achieving something in life that I had worked for.
And that's where you have like you use like Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah.
Once your basic needs are of food, shelter, safety, or then you can build, or Norman Vincent Peale, or also what you had was in 1999, you have that field with Dr. Martin Seligman out of the University of Pennsylvania that created positive psychology, which was looking at the healthy mind. And that's where we got all of these ideas of contentment and gratitude and meditation and mindfulness. So that's how we got sort of into this, and all of that became these personal pursuits to this sort of improving myself and things like that. So how do you think our society today defines the idea of the pursuit of happiness and their interpretation of what it means to them? The fact that it's in the Declaration of Independence. Like, I sort of feel like it's sort of saying to me, I have an entitlement. Like, I have an entitlement to be happy, because it says it right here in this document about the foundation of our country.
It's an inalienable natural right.
Right. So what do you think? Do you think that's true? Do you think that's the definition for today?
Well, I mean, I have my own opinions about these things, I suppose, but my sense is that, again, we have a hyper-individualistic definition of happiness.
I would add narcissistic in there, personally. But.
Well, I didn't want to go there because it's not my show, but, there is a kind of criticism of this obsession with one's own self, the culture of narcissism, Christopher Lasch, amusing ourselves to death. I'm fond of a book called Affluenza, which is like we just consume so much because we think it'll make us happy that we end up with this sense of sort of emptiness, and incompleteness. We've replaced owning things or maybe achieving career success with, again, maybe what an earlier tradition might describe as true happiness.
Which goes back to imaginary happiness versus true happiness.
Yeah, it's an important distinction to hold on to.
So as a historian, and also because in part you've had your own very interesting background. I mean, you grew up in a very, I would say, poor household, and you also, you moved to 15 different communities in Ohio and Pennsylvania before you left for college. You really were intentional. You talked about that you lived in the hillbilly elegy type of world, and you really wanted to create a different kind of living than your father led. So you wanted a stable occupation, you wanted not living on the margins, you wanted not to have the fear of financial ruin. And the reason I'm putting all this telling on the table is because I want to ask you as a historian, and with your background, putting in context, how do you define happiness for you?
I haven't really thought about it very deeply. I think when I was at that stage of my life, I think I want to be happy in life, then it has to have these attributes, because I was contrasting that experience with my parents, who were very loving parents in many ways, but just struggled financially. And I was like, they don't look happy. They didn't appear to me to have a high level of life satisfaction, And so at that stage, I think that happiness for me had that particular kind of component, the career, the attainment of financial stability. And I think as I've grown older, and those things are sort of not an issue for me anymore, then you look to other things. It's like I find happiness in, being with my family. I find happiness in, perhaps maybe, doing a really good class where I feel like I'm actually, taking advantage of my skills and talents and my experiences, and I'm actually doing something good, like what we would call good work. Good work can bring happiness. Like if you're a craftsman or you're somebody who's, I don't know, just involved in creating
that would be part
something.
of that civic duty of contributing and
doing good work
right.
in the world, I think is a way I would define happiness, because you have a contribution to make. You have particular skills and talents and abilities. You have a genius unto yourself. Well, how do you maximize that and then contribute to the creativity that's in the world, to the other people's overall well-being, because you may be skilled in like medicine or something like that, you may be skilled in science and technology, and you have something to contribute. So I think the older I get, the more I'm inclined to think that that's happiness, is doing good work in the world.
And making a difference?
Yeah.
So, as you know, at the end of each And Good Company program, I ask guests the same 12 questions that French novelist Marcel Proust popularized from a Victorian parlor game. But because I've had the pleasure of having you here at the table already, you've already answered my first 2 sets of questions. But believe it or not, I have another set for you. So, what do you most dislike about your appearance?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I'm generally pretty satisfied with how I look. I wish I had more hair.
Which living person do you most despise?
Do I most despise? I'm not allowed to talk about hating people. I'm not a hater.
It's not. Despising is not hating. Is there, which living person? Okay, you can do it from a historic perspective if you wanted.
I'll take a pass on that.
Okay. You're not allowed to take a pass. What is the quality you most like in a man?
A sense of responsibility.
What is the quality you like most in a woman?
I would say probably joy. You know,
What
a
or
sense
who?
of joy.
What joy?
A sense of joy.
Sense of joy. What or who is the greatest love of your life?
What or who? Definitely family. You know, my wife and my two boys are the thing I think that I love the hardest, you know, of all the things.
When and where were you happiest?
When and where was I happiest? Believe it or not, probably, if not now, then certainly it would be kind of like when I was struggling a little bit with my wife and we were starting to build a family and we were building careers together, and it was exciting because a lot of our future was still out there for us and we were making decisions about that future, and it was kind of exciting. You know?
And you were doing good work. If you could change one thing about yourself, what would it be?
I would say probably I would be more organized, you know, because I tend to sort of let things become chaotic. And
Which historical figure do you most identify with?
that's a good question. Well, I've spent a whole lot of time in the world of some of these colonial figures, and so I find myself laughing and feeling a kindred kind of spirit with Franklin, because he's pretty funny. Like, he tries to, you know what I mean, find the light side of things. And,
Well, he tries to be a little self-deprecating.
Yes,
Yeah.
there's something about that I find
Yeah.
really appealing.
What is your most marked characteristic?
People say that I'm super like laid back, so I would say that if people like got together and decided I had some characteristic, it would be he's a pretty laid back guy.
Who are your heroes in real life?
Probably, I would say probably my 2 sisters who have lived very interesting and meaningful lives in different ways. My own wife is my hero. She, you know, works extremely hard and is a terrific mother and a wonderful spouse. So,
Who is your hero in fiction?
you're going to find the end of my. I read so little fiction. I feel terrible about that, but can I come back to that one?
No, you already passed on one. What about a superhero? Is there a superhero you admire more than others?
You mean the Marvel ones?
Yeah.
Sure, I'll go with Iron Man, just to kind of give you an answer.
Okay. What is your motto?
I've never developed one. Work hard, play hard. How's that?
Good. So I want to thank you, Dr. Jeffery Webb, Professor of History at Huntington University, for again having a seat at our table and helping to bring a historical perspective to this idea and this ever quest of the pursuit of happiness, and at least giving us some ideas, insight into what Thomas Jefferson was thinking when he gave us the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness.
It was an enjoyable conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And you can learn more about And Good Company and all the other great conversations we have had at andgoodcompany.info. And we look forward to next week, when you can again enjoy a seat at the table for great conversation and good company.